Somewhere in the middle of an avoidant relationship, a question starts forming that almost never gets asked out loud because asking it feels too dangerous, too close to admitting something might already be true. The question is simple: am I the one, or am I just what's available right now? And the terrifying part isn't the question itself, it's that avoidants, more than almost any other attachment style, actually do treat these two categories of people in measurably different ways. And most partners spend years unable to tell which category they've landed in, because the differences are subtle enough to explain away, and devastating enough, once finally seen clearly, to change everything. This isn't going to be a comparison built on stories or specific situations. It's going to be an anatomy of two internal experiences. The one an avoidant has when they're genuinely, terrifyingly in love, and the one they have when someone has simply become a convenient, familiar presence in their life. Because those two experiences produce wildly different behaviour, even when, from the outside, both relationships can look almost identical for long stretches of time. Anyone listening who has spent months, maybe years, trying to decode which version of themselves they were to an avoidant partner, deserves to hear this clearly before anything else gets said. The exhaustion of that guessing game was never a personal failing. Avoidants are, often without meaning to be, some of the most confusing people to read in existence, because their outward behaviour rarely matches their internal experience, and the gap between those two things is exactly where all the confusion lives. To understand the difference between being the one and being the option, the starting point has to be fear, because fear is the operating system underneath almost everything an avoidant does. Every avoidant carries some version of a belief that closeness eventually leads to loss, engulfment, or the unbearable exposure of being fully known and found wanting. That fear doesn't disappear depending on who they're with. What changes is how loudly it speaks, and that volume is almost entirely dictated by how much an avoidant actually stands to lose. Here is the strange, almost backwards truth at the centre of everything that follows. The person an avoidant loves the most is often the person they run from the hardest. Not because the feelings are weaker, but because the feelings are so much stronger that the fear underneath them becomes unbearable. Meanwhile, the option, the person who never quite threatened to become essential, often receives a version of the avoidant that looks warmer, easier, more available, simply because there was never enough at stake to trigger the deeper defences. This single distinction reframes almost everything. Warmth is not proof of depth. Ease is not proof of importance. In fact, for an avoidant, the opposite is frequently closer to the truth. The relationship that feels the most comfortable to them is often the one that matters the least, and the relationship that feels the most turbulent, the most inconsistent, the most maddeningly hard to pin down, is often the one carrying the most weight. It also helps to name, clearly and early, what does not determine which category a person falls into, because so much unnecessary self-blame gets built on faulty assumptions here. Attractiveness doesn't determine it. Effort doesn't determine it. In fact, excessive effort can sometimes push someone further into the option category, because relentless giving can inadvertently signal that nothing further needs to be risked or reciprocated. Compatibility on paper doesn't determine it either, since plenty of deeply compatible pairings never activate an avoidance fear response at all, while seemingly mismatched connections sometimes trigger it intensely. What actually determines the category has almost nothing to do with the qualities of the person being loved, and almost everything to do with how much unguarded exposure that particular connection demands from the avoidant's own nervous system. This is worth repeating because it dismantles a specific, painful belief many people quietly carry, that if they had simply been prettier, more accomplished, more agreeable, more patient, they would have been chosen as the one instead of relegated to the option. Worth was never the variable being measured. Threat was. Consider what happens inside an avoidant when someone becomes what could be called an option. An option is, by definition, replaceable in the avoidant's own private calculation, even if that replaceability is never spoken aloud, even if the avoidant themselves would deny it if confronted. Because this person doesn't threaten the avoidant's sense of independence, the avoidant's nervous system doesn't treat them as a danger. They can be warm without fear of losing themselves. They can be consistent because consistency doesn't require the kind of vulnerability that consistency with someone truly loved would demand. The relationship can feel, paradoxically, easier and more stable, precisely because so little of the avoidant's deeper self is actually being risked inside it. This is one of the cruelest truths anyone loving an avoidant can encounter, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than softened. Sometimes the reason a relationship with an avoidant feels calm, pleasant, uncomplicated is not because it's healthy or deeply connected. It's because it's shallow enough that the avoidant never had to access the parts of themselves capable of sabotage, avoidance, or panic. Depth is what activates an avoidant's defenses. Where there's no depth being asked for, there's nothing for those defenses to guard against. For someone listening who has watched an avoidant seem effortlessly kind, easygoing, and present with someone else, while remembering how hard, how inconsistent, how confusing that same avoidant was with them, this reframing matters enormously. That ease witnessed elsewhere wasn't necessarily proof of greater love. It might simply have been proof of lesser stakes. Comfort for an avoidant often signals shallow water, not deep affection. Now consider what happens when an avoidant actually falls in love, truly, dangerously, in the way that threatens the entire architecture they've built their identity around. This is where behaviour stops looking like warmth and starts looking, often, like retreat, inconsistency, or even something that resembles cruelty, despite none of it originating from a lack of feeling. It originates from an excess of feeling that the avoidant has no internal framework for managing safely. When an avoidant senses real love forming, several things tend to happen almost simultaneously, and understanding them individually helps make sense of behaviour that otherwise seems contradictory or cruel. First, there's an intensification of the very defences that felt unnecessary with an option. Distance increases, not because interest is decreasing, but because the interest itself has become frightening. Second, there's often a corresponding increase in idealization and devaluation, a rapid, exhausting oscillation between treating the person as extraordinary and treating them as somehow too much, too intense, too demanding, even when their behaviour hasn't actually changed at all. Third, and this is the piece almost nobody explains well, there's frequently a subconscious testing process in which the avoidant behaves in ways almost designed to see whether the person will leave, because leaving would confirm the belief that closeness always eventually ends in loss, and staying, paradoxically, terrifies them even more, because staying means the fear has to be faced rather than confirmed and avoided. This is where so much unnecessary suffering gets created, on both sides. The partner experiencing this often interprets the avoidant's escalating distance as evidence of diminishing love, when very often it signals almost the opposite. It's a nervous system responding to a threat level that only exists because the feelings underneath are so significant. Meanwhile, the avoidant themselves often can't articulate any of this because much of it is happening below the level of conscious awareness. They don't wake up and decide to sabotage something they value. They simply feel an escalating discomfort they don't have language for and pull back instinctively, the way anyone might flinch from unexpected heat without consciously deciding to. There's a metaphor worth holding on to here. Picture someone standing at the edge of very deep water who has spent their entire life associating depth with drowning, having once, long ago, nearly gone under and never fully recovered from the memory of that helplessness. An option is like wading in ankle-deep water beside this person, easy, pleasant, entirely within their comfort and control. Real love is like being pulled against every defense they've built toward the deep end, toward water they cannot control, cannot predict, and cannot escape from once they're fully in it. Nobody swims calmly toward the place they associate with almost drowning, even if some part of them desperately wants to reach the other side. This explains one of the most painful patterns anyone loving an avoidant tends to encounter. The sense that the deeper the relationship becomes, the more erratic the avoidant's behaviour gets, rather than the relationship settling into greater security, the way most people expect intimacy to naturally produce over time. For an avoidant genuinely in love, security is often experienced as instability, precisely because security requires the kind of surrender they've spent their whole life avoiding. Instability, ironically, can feel more familiar, more survivable, because it doesn't ask them to fully hand over control. Here's something that deserves real validation for anyone who has lived through this confusion. If a relationship with an avoidant felt harder, more unpredictable, more emotionally exhausting than it seemed like it should, that difficulty was very likely not a reflection of how little the avoidant cared. It may very well have been a reflection of how much. This doesn't excuse the pain caused along the way, and it doesn't mean staying was the right choice, or that enduring chaos disguised as love was ever sustainable or healthy. But it can offer something important, a rewriting of a story that often gets told backwards, where the person who was actually loved most deeply mistakenly concludes they were loved the least, simply because love, for an avoidant, doesn't always look like ease. That said, it would be dishonest and ultimately harmful to suggest that difficulty always equals depth. Not every inconsistent, confusing avoidant relationship is secretly a great love story hiding behind bad behaviour. Sometimes distance really is just distance. Sometimes inconsistency really is just a lack of investment, dressed up in the language of fear. The distinction matters enormously, and there are ways to tell the difference. Ways that go beyond simply hoping the harder version of the story is the more romantic one. The clearest distinguishing factor isn't intensity, it's effort under discomfort. An avoidant who is truly, dangerously in love with someone will often still show up, imperfectly, inconsistently, clumsily, but they will show up, even while retreating. They might disappear and then return, with visible discomfort at their own disappearance. They might struggle to articulate feelings, but still attempt to, however badly. They might sabotage and then, at some point, attempt some form of repair, even if that repair is delayed, awkward, or incomplete. What defines true love from an avoidant is not the absence of avoidance. It's the presence of struggle against that avoidance. Evidence that something inside them is fighting the pull toward retreat, even if that fight is often losing. An option, by contrast, rarely receives this struggle, because there's nothing internally at stake requiring a fight in the first place. The avoidant can retreat completely, without much internal friction, because retreating doesn't threaten anything they consider essential to protect. There's no urgency to return, because nothing valuable feels at risk of being lost. The relationship with an option often simply fades, evenly, without much visible internal conflict, because the avoidance system was never activated strongly enough to produce conflict to begin with. This distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to understand their own experience. Chaos alone isn't proof of love, but chaos accompanied by visible, if clumsy, attempts at return, repair, or reconnection often is meaningfully different from chaos that simply repeats without any counterbalancing effort at all. One is a nervous system in genuine conflict. The other is a nervous system that was never conflicted in the first place, because there was nothing significant enough at stake to create conflict. There's another layer worth exploring, because it explains a specific kind of confusion many partners experience. Avoidants often treat the person they love most with a strange kind of protectiveness that can look, on the surface, like coldness or withholding. Because loving someone deeply means the potential loss of that person becomes catastrophic in the avoidant's imagination. Some avoidants unconsciously begin limiting how much they invest, not because they want less, but because they're trying, in a deeply misguided way, to protect themselves in advance from a devastation they're terrified of eventually facing. It's a preemptive flinch, bracing for an impact that hasn't happened yet, sometimes so consistently that the relationship never gets the chance to develop the security that might have eventually made the bracing unnecessary. With an option, there's no such preemptive bracing, because there's no imagined catastrophe worth bracing against. Losing an option doesn't threaten the avoidant's internal world the same way losing someone truly loved would. This is why, paradoxically, some avoidants can be generous, attentive, even affectionate with someone who ultimately matters far less to them than someone they treat with visible caution and distance. Generosity, for an avoidant, often flows more easily towards situations that feel safe precisely because they aren't essential. It helps to look more closely at what this contrast actually looks like when it comes to specific categories of behaviour, because the differences, once named individually, become much easier to recognise in retrospect than they ever were while living inside them. Consider the way an avoidant handles conflict with each type of person. With an option, conflict tends to be almost administrative. Something is raised, addressed at a surface level, and resolved quickly, often because neither party has enough invested for the disagreement to threaten anything foundational. There isn't much charge behind it because the stakes underneath are genuinely low. With someone truly loved, conflict often becomes disproportionately intense, not because the issue itself is larger, but because the avoidance fear response has been fully activated. A small disagreement can suddenly feel, internally, like an existential threat to the relationship's survival, which is why avoidants in real love sometimes overreact, withdraw entirely, or go silent for extended periods after arguments that, on paper, seem relatively minor. The intensity isn't about the argument, it's about what the argument represents. Proof that the relationship, and by extension the avoidant's own emotional exposure, is fragile and could end. Consider, too, the way future plans get discussed. With an option, an avoidant can often speak about the future with surprising ease, precisely because that future doesn't feel binding in any way that threatens their sense of freedom. Vague, comfortable statements about shared plans can come easily, because none of it carries real emotional weight. With someone truly loved, future conversations often become a minefield. Avoidants may avoid the topic entirely, deflect with humour, or become unexpectedly anxious when plans start feeling concrete, not because they don't want that future, but because wanting it that badly is exactly what terrifies them. The very intensity of their desire is what triggers the retreat, an almost unbearable irony that many partners never get the chance to understand while they're living through it. Physical affection often follows a similar pattern, though it can be one of the more confusing markers because it doesn't always move in the direction people expect. With an option, physical closeness can feel easy and uncomplicated, offered freely because it doesn't carry the same symbolic weight it does in a relationship that actually threatens the avoidance defenses. With someone truly loved, physical affection can become inconsistent in a way that feels bewildering, abundant in moments when the avoidant feels safe and in control, and suddenly withdrawn in moments when vulnerability spikes beyond what they can tolerate. This inconsistency is rarely about attraction or affection diminishing. It's about a nervous system trying to regulate closeness the way someone might try to regulate the temperature of water that keeps swinging unpredictably between comfortable and scalding. Communication patterns reveal something important as well. With an option, communication tends to be steady, predictable, low in emotional volatility, because there isn't enough at stake to produce dramatic fluctuation. With someone truly loved, communication often becomes erratic in a very particular way. Periods of intense, almost overwhelming engagement, followed by unexplained withdrawal, followed by an eventual, often clumsy attempt to return and re-engage. This oscillation, uncomfortable as it is to experience, is frequently a much stronger indicator of deep investment than steady, uneventful consistency ever could be. Precisely because steadiness with an avoidant often signals low emotional stakes rather than high commitment. There's a particular kind of jealousy and possessiveness that also distinguishes the two categories, though it doesn't always show up as loudly as people expect. Avoidants aren't always visibly possessive people, because possessiveness itself requires an admission of attachment they're often deeply uncomfortable making. But subtle signs tend to surface with someone truly loved that never appear with an option. A flicker of discomfort when that person's attention goes elsewhere. A quiet, almost involuntary attentiveness to that person's life, even while maintaining outward distance. Small, uncharacteristic attempts to stay relevant in that person's world, even during periods of avoidance. With an option, this kind of quiet vigilance is largely absent because there's no underlying fear of loss driving it. None of these markers, taken individually, offer certainty. Human behaviour is rarely so clean that a single sign proves anything definitively. But taken together as a pattern, they begin to paint a picture that's far more reliable than surface-level warmth or ease ever could be on their own. The question was never simply how kind or how present an avoidant seemed. The far more revealing question has always been where their fear showed up and how intensely. Because fear, for an avoidant, is one of the most honest signals available, even when it expresses itself in ways that look nothing like the tenderness people usually associate with real love. It also matters to address what determines, in the first place, whether someone becomes the one an avoidant truly loves or the option they simply settle beside. This isn't usually a matter of objective compatibility, attractiveness, or even shared values, though those things certainly play some role. More than anything else, it tends to come down to how much a particular person's presence threatens the avoidant's carefully maintained sense of independence and control. Someone who asks for very little, who accepts inconsistency without much protest, who doesn't require deep emotional reciprocity, can often remain in the option category almost indefinitely, not because they matter less objectively, but because they never forced the avoidant's deeper defences into activation. By contrast, someone who brings depth, who asks difficult questions, who requires honesty and presence rather than surface-level participation, is often the person who ends up representing genuine threat, and therefore genuine love, in the avoidant's internal world. This is a difficult truth to sit with because it means that the partners who advocated most strongly for real intimacy, who pushed back against avoidance, who refused to settle for surface-level participation, were often the very people who triggered the most defensive, confusing, painful behaviour, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because they were doing something profoundly right. They were asking for real love, and real love was exactly what the avoidant didn't yet know how to receive without panic. This reframes a story that so many people carry with quiet shame. The belief that if they had simply asked for less, wanted less, needed less, the relationship might have gone more smoothly. In some narrow, practical sense, that might even be true. Asking for less might have produced a calmer, easier dynamic. But calmer and easier, as this entire exploration has shown, doesn't mean healthier, deeper, or more loved. It often means the opposite. Choosing to want real intimacy, even when it produced chaos, wasn't a mistake to regret. It was an accurate, if painful, signal of exactly how much was actually at stake. There's a related pattern worth examining, because it explains why some avoidants seem to stay for years in relationships that never fully deepen, while others leave relatively quickly once real intensity starts to build. The determining factor usually isn't how much affection exists. It's how much perceived risk the avoidant associates with staying versus leaving. Sometimes staying in the shallow, option-like version of a relationship feels safer, simply because it requires no confrontation with deeper fear at all. Other times, when love has already grown too large to contain within a shallow arrangement, leaving becomes the only way the avoidant's nervous system can imagine escaping a vulnerability it doesn't yet know how to survive. This is where long-term relationships involving avoidance tend to split into two broad, recognizable shapes. The first shape involves a relationship that remains pleasant, stable, and enduring, precisely because it never asks too much of the avoidant emotionally. Both people might describe the relationship as comfortable, even happy, without either one ever quite naming the absence of a deeper current running beneath it. This isn't necessarily a tragedy for everyone involved. Some partners are genuinely content with this kind of steady companionship, and there's nothing inherently wrong with choosing comfort deliberately, with full awareness of what it is and isn't providing. The difficulty arises only when one partner believed, the entire time, that they were experiencing the deepest possible version of the avoidance love, when in fact they were experiencing the version reserved for someone who never quite threatened the deeper defences at all. The second shape involves a relationship that becomes genuinely turbulent, marked by cycles of intense closeness, followed by unexplained withdrawal, followed by anxious, clumsy attempts at repair. This is, as already discussed, frequently the shape that indicates real, threatening love. But it's worth being honest about something uncomfortable here as well. This shape is also exhausting, often unsustainable, and sometimes genuinely damaging to the partner living inside it, regardless of how much love it may represent on the avoidance side. Depth of feeling doesn't automatically translate into a relationship worth staying in. A connection can be simultaneously real, profound, and still be the wrong choice to remain inside of, if the cost of staying continues to outweigh whatever growth or connection is being gained. Recognizing that someone loved deeply is not the same as concluding that the relationship, in its unhealed form, deserved to continue. This distinction matters enormously for anyone still working through the aftermath of a relationship like this. It is entirely possible to hold two truths side by side without contradiction. That an avoidant partner's chaotic, inconsistent behaviour may have stemmed from genuine, even overwhelming love, and that walking away from that chaos was still the healthiest decision available, given that love without the capacity for safety and consistency often produces more harm than connection over time. Depth is not the same as sustainability, and it was never selfish or wrong to require both. There's a further piece worth naming because it addresses something many partners quietly wonder about long after these relationships end. Whether an avoidant partner will ever be capable of giving someone else the security they couldn't provide before. This is impossible to answer with certainty for any specific person, and false certainty in either direction tends to cause more harm than honesty. What can be said, based on how these patterns generally function, is that change is possible, but rarely automatic. It typically requires the avoidant to have gone through some version of the reckoning already described, a genuine collapse of old defences, followed by real, sustained effort to build new ones. Effort that persists even during ordinary, non-crisis moments, when there's no immediate threat forcing insight into existence. Without that sustained work, most avoidants simply recreate the same essential dynamic in their next relationship, treating a new option with the same surface-level ease, and eventually finding a new version of threatening depth to retreat from in the same familiar ways. This isn't meant as a discouraging prediction so much as an honest one, because false hope about a specific future outcome tends to keep people tethered to uncertainty long after tethering has stopped serving them. Whether a particular avoidant changes is ultimately none of anyone else's responsibility to manage, predict, or wait around for. The only relationship anyone truly has full authority over is the one they choose to have with their own healing, their own worth, and their own capacity to build a future defined by something more secure than waiting to find out whether someone else finally, eventually, learns how to stop being afraid. There's something worth saying too about the particular loneliness of loving an avoidant while quietly suspecting, the whole time, that the relationship might never fully arrive at the depth being offered. That suspicion, that persistent background hum of uncertainty, is one of the more exhausting parts of this dynamic, because it requires holding hope and doubt simultaneously for extended periods of time, sometimes years, without ever getting a clear enough signal to resolve the tension one way or the other. Anyone who lived through that particular exhaustion deserves to hear that it was a real and valid form of suffering, not an overreaction, not evidence of being too needy or too impatient. Uncertainty, sustained over long periods, is genuinely destabilizing to a nervous system, regardless of attachment style. And needing it to resolve wasn't asking for too much. It was asking for something every person is entitled to ask for in a relationship meant to be a source of security, rather than a permanent guessing game. It's worth closing this particular exploration with something that applies regardless of which category someone occupied in an avoidance internal world. Worth is not something an avoidance fear response gets to determine. Whether someone was treated as the one or as the option reveals a great deal about the avoidant's internal psychology, their fears, their history, their capacity or incapacity for vulnerability at that particular point in their life. It reveals comparatively little about the actual worth, lovability, or value of the person on the receiving end of that treatment. A person can be extraordinary, worthy of deep, uncomplicated love, and still receive a confusing, inconsistent version of affection from someone whose fear response happened to be activated by exactly how extraordinary they were. Feel whole.